The gunshot echoed through the valley like thunder, sending a flock of startled birds into the crisp Montana sky. Abigail Sutton pressed her back against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine, her breath coming in short, painful gasps as she clutched the leather satchel to her chest. Blood seeped through her fingers where the bullet had grazed her side. It was 1876, and she was a long way from Boston, with nothing but wilderness between her and certain death. "Ain't no use running, Miss Sutton," the gravelly voice of Silas Holden carried through the trees. "Your pa's debts are due, and somebody's gotta pay." Abigail's legs trembled beneath her dusty skirts. The stagecoach she'd been traveling on lay overturned 2 miles back, the driver dead and the other passengers scattered. She'd been running for what felt like hours, the weight of her father's sins and his secret journal heavy in her hands. Another shot cracked through the air, splintering wood inches from her head. With a strangled cry, she pushed away from the tree and stumbled forward, her city boots ill-suited for the rugged terrain. The pain in her side flared with each step, but she pressed on, knowing that stopping meant far worse than physical pain. The ground suddenly gave way beneath her feet. Abigail tumbled down a steep embankment, rocks and brambles tearing at her clothes and skin before she landed with a splash in the shallow edge of a creek. Dazed and gasping, she dragged herself toward the opposite bank. "You look like you could use some help, madam." The deep voice startled her so badly that she nearly collapsed back into the water. Through the wet strands of hair plastered to her face, Abigail looked up to find herself staring at the business end of a Winchester rifle. Her gaze traveled upward to the man holding it, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but his eyes were startlingly clear and steady. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rushing water. "They're going to kill me." The man tilted his head slightly, as if straining to hear her. He knelt down, keeping the rifle raised toward the direction she'd come from. "My voice is weak," she admitted, embarrassed by her feebleness even in this desperate moment. The cowboy whispered, "I hear you louder than the world." He extended his free hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Abigail reached for it. His calloused palm was warm against her cold, trembling fingers. "Name's Quinn Garrett," he said, pulling her effortlessly to her feet, "and it sounds like we'd best be moving along." The shouts of Holden's men grew closer. Quinn's expression hardened as he assessed the blood soaking through Abigail's torn dress. "Can you ride?" he asked, already guiding her toward a magnificent chestnut stallion tethered nearby. Abigail nodded, though in truth she hadn't been on a horse since she was a child. I think so. Good enough." With surprising gentleness, he helped her mount, then swung up behind her, one strong arm wrapped securely around her waist, careful to avoid her wound. "Hold tight, miss." "Abigail," she answered, clutching the saddle horn. "Abigail Sutton." Quinn clicked his tongue and the horse lurched forward. "Well, Miss Sutton, I reckon you've got quite a story to tell." As they thundered away from the creek, Abigail pressed the precious satchel more tightly against her chest. If only he knew the half of it. The horse's powerful strides ate up the distance, carrying them deeper into the wilderness. Quinn handled the reins with the confidence of someone born to the saddle, navigating the uneven terrain with ease. Though her side throbbed with pain and her clothes were soaked through, Abigail felt a strange sense of security in this stranger's embrace. "We're coming up on my cabin," Quinn said after they'd been riding for nearly an hour. His breath was warm against her ear. "It's not much, but it's defensible and those men won't find it easy." Through the trees, a small log structure emerged, nestled against the side of a hill and surrounded by pines. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney. Quinn brought the horse to a stop, and dismounted in one fluid motion before reaching up to help Abigail down. Her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground. Quinn caught her easily, sweeping her into his arms. "Sorry," she mumbled, mortified by her weakness. "Nothing to be sorry for," he replied, carrying her toward the cabin door. "You've been shot, thrown from a stagecoach, and chased through the woods. Most folks would have given up by now." Inside, the cabin was simple but tidy, a far cry from the primitive frontier dwelling Abigail had expected. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a rough-hewn table and chairs sat in the center, and a curtained-off area presumably contained a bed. Shelves lined with books caught her eye, an unexpected sight that momentarily distracted her from her pain. Quinn set her gently on a chair and moved to stoke the fire. "I need to look at that wound," he said, his back to her as he worked. "And then you're going to tell me why those men want you dead." Abigail clutched the satchel tighter. "How do I know I can trust you?" Quinn turned, his expression unreadable. "You don't, but I'm not the one who put a bullet in your side." He gestured to the leather bag. "And I'm guessing whatever's in there is what they're really after." She hesitated, then slowly nodded. "My father was a geologist for the Northern Pacific Railroad. He found something they weren't expecting." Her fingers traced the brass buckle of the satchel. "Gold deposits, extensive ones, on land that's supposed to be protected by treaty with the Blackfeet tribe." Quinn's eyes narrowed. "And let me guess, instead of reporting it to his employers, he decided to make a record for himself." "He wanted to warn the tribe," Abigail said defensively. "But before he could, he was killed. They called it an accident, but I knew better." She swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "He sent me this journal just before he died, with instructions to deliver it to a man named Red Eagle. I thought I could trust the stagecoach driver, but Holden's men got to him first," Quinn finished, his voice grim. He moved toward her, kneeling to examine her side. "I need to clean this wound. It'll hurt, but infection out here is a death sentence." Abigail nodded, steeling herself as Quinn gathered supplies: a bottle of whiskey, clean cloths, and a small leather kit. He worked with efficiency, cutting away the torn fabric of her dress to reveal the angry gash along her ribs. "It's not deep," he assessed, pouring water into a basin. "Bullet just grazed you. You're lucky." "It doesn't feel like luck," she said through gritted teeth as he began to clean the wound. Quinn's hands were surprisingly gentle for their size and roughness. "Luck is relative out here. You're alive. The folks on that stagecoach can't say the same." When he poured whiskey over the wound, Abigail couldn't suppress a cry of pain. Quinn murmured an apology, his calloused fingers steady as he worked. "How do you know so much about treating wounds?" she asked, desperate for distraction from the burning pain. A shadow crossed his face. "War teaches a man things he'd rather not know." He didn't elaborate, focusing instead on bandaging her side with strips of clean linen. When he finished, Quinn stood and moved to the fireplace, hanging a kettle over the flames. "You need food and rest. Tomorrow we'll figure out how to find this Red Eagle. You'll help me?" Abigail asked, surprised. Quinn turned to face her, his expression somber. "Miss Sutton, I've spent too many years watching powerful men take what isn't theirs. If your father was trying to do right by the Blackfeet, then I aim to see his work finished." He paused. "Besides, those men will keep coming. You won't make it alone." Relief washed over her, followed quickly by suspicion. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe I'm not as much a stranger as you think." He reached into his shirt and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Your father wrote to me too about a month ago. Said if anything happened to him, his daughter might come looking for help." Abigail stared at him in disbelief. "My father knew you, not personally, but he knew of me. I used to scout for the army before." He trailed off, his gaze distant. Let's just say I've got no love for the railroad men or their schemes. As Quinn prepared a simple meal of beans and dried venison, Abigail studied him surreptitiously. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to solitude and self-reliance. His face, now visible in the firelight, was weathered by sun and wind, with lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into many horizons. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense that Boston society might appreciate, but there was something compelling in the quiet strength he exuded. "How long have you lived out here alone?" she asked as he handed her a tin cup of coffee. "5 years, give or take." Quinn settled into the chair across from her. "After the war, I couldn't stomach being around too many people. The mountains make better company most days. It must be lonely," he shrugged. "Peaceful is a better word, though I'll admit it's nice to have conversation that isn't just with my horse." Despite everything, Abigail found herself smiling. "Does your horse talk back?" "Only when I've had too much of this," Quinn said, raising his own coffee cup with a wry grin that transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. As night fell, Quinn insisted Abigail take his bed while he slept near the fire. Despite her protests about imposing, she was asleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow, exhaustion and pain medicine claiming her consciousness. She dreamed of her father, his kind eyes and patient explanations, as he showed her rock specimens, and taught her to read the stories written in layers of earth. In the dream, he was trying to tell her something important, but his voice kept fading, replaced by the sound of gunshots and galloping hooves. Abigail woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Moonlight filtered through the cabin's single window, casting Quinn's sleeping form in silver light. He lay on his side, one arm curled under his head, his breathing deep and even. For the first time since receiving news of her father's death, Abigail felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone anymore. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she faced them with an unexpected ally, a solitary cowboy, who somehow heard her when the rest of the world had turned away. Outside, an owl called into the night, its mournful cry a reminder of the wilderness surrounding them. Tomorrow they would begin their journey to find Red Eagle, carrying her father's final message and perhaps, Abigail thought as sleep reclaimed her, a chance to find justice in this lawless land. Morning came with pale sunlight filtering through the cabin windows and the smell of coffee brewing. Abigail opened her eyes to find Quinn already awake and moving quietly around the small space. He had laid out fresh clothes, men's clothing, she noted with surprise on the foot of the bed. "Hope you don't mind," he said when he noticed her watching. "They'll be too big, but they're clean and more practical for riding than what's left of your dress." Abigail fingered the soft flannel shirt and sturdy trousers. In Boston, the mere thought of a woman in men's clothing would cause scandalized whispers for weeks, but Boston felt very far away now. "Thank you," she said, sitting up gingerly. The pain in her side had dulled to a persistent ache. "It's very practical." A hint of amusement touched Quinn's eyes. "There's water for washing behind the screen. We should leave soon. Holden's men will be widening their search." After he stepped outside to give her privacy, Abigail dressed carefully, rolling up the sleeves and pant legs of the oversized clothes. When she emerged from behind the screen, she felt strangely liberated despite the impropriety of her appearance. The trousers allowed freedom of movement she'd never experienced in skirts and petticoats. Quinn paused in the doorway when he returned, his expression unreadable as he took in her transformed appearance. "You'll need a hat," he said finally, reaching for one hanging on a peg. "And we should bind your hair." His fingers brushed hers as he handed over the hat, a brief contact that sent an unexpected warmth through her. Abigail turned away quickly, busying herself with twisting her long auburn hair into a tight knot at the nape of her neck. Over a breakfast of cornbread and coffee, Quinn spread out a rough map on the table. "Red Eagle's band usually summers here, near the confluence of two rivers," he explained, pointing to a spot marked with a small X. "It's 3 days' ride if we push hard and the weather holds." "Will they welcome us?" Abigail asked, studying the map. "I understand relations between whites and the Blackfeet have been strained." Quinn's mouth tightened. "That's one way of putting it. The government's broken every treaty they've made. But Red Eagle is a respected elder who's worked to maintain peace. Your father's warning might help prevent bloodshed if the railroad tries to move onto their land." He rolled up the map and fixed her with a serious look. "Miss Sutton, once we leave this cabin, we're exposed. Holden's men won't be the only danger. The territory's full of desperate people, and 2 travelers especially with 1 injured make tempting targets." "I understand the risks," Abigail said, meeting his gaze steadily. "My father died trying to do what's right. I won't dishonor his memory by turning back now." Something like respect flickered in Quinn's eyes. "Then we'd best get moving." Within the hour, they had packed supplies, doused the fire, and obscured any signs of their departure around the cabin. Quinn helped Abigail mount the chestnut stallion, then swung up behind her. "This is Thunder," he said, patting the horse's neck. "Best mount I've ever had. He'll get us there." As they set off through the pines, Abigail was acutely aware of Quinn's presence, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the careful way his arm held her secure without pressing against her injured side. It was strange to be so physically close to a man she barely knew. Yet something about Quinn Garrett inspired trust, despite his rugged exterior and obvious reservations. They rode in companionable silence for much of the morning, stopping only briefly to rest Thunder and drink from a clear stream. As they continued, the terrain grew more rugged, the forest giving way to rocky outcroppings and steep ravines. "This route's longer," Quinn explained as they picked their way along a narrow trail, "but less likely to be watched. Holden's men will expect us to head for the nearest town." "How do you know so much about them?" Abigail asked. Quinn was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. "I crossed paths with Silas Holden during the war," he finally said, his voice tight. "He was a supply officer who made a fortune selling army provisions on the black market while our boys went hungry. After the war, he reinvented himself as a respectable businessman, but he's still the same snake. And now he works for the railroad," Abigail murmured. "Men like Holden always follow the money. The Northern Pacific means new towns, new mines, new opportunities for profit, legal or otherwise." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Your father must have discovered something big for Holden to come after you personally." Abigail thought of the journal in her satchel, its pages filled with her father's precise handwriting and detailed maps. He wrote that the gold deposits could be the largest ever found in the territory, if the railroad secretly mines it while claiming to build track. "They get rich while the government looks the other way and the Blackfeet lose their land forever," Quinn finished grimly. "It's an old story out here." By midday, the sun beat down mercilessly. Abigail's wound throbbed with renewed intensity, and she found herself leaning more heavily against Quinn, fighting to stay upright in the saddle. "There's a place ahead where we can rest," Quinn said, his breath warm against her ear. "Just a little further." The place turned out to be a small cave set into a hillside, invisible from the main trail and sheltered by a stand of juniper trees. Inside, it was cool and surprisingly dry, with room enough to stand comfortably. Old trappers used this spot years back, Quinn explained as he helped Abigail dismount. Not many remember it now. He eased her down against the cave wall, then quickly set about caring for Thunder before returning with their provisions. The simple act of dismounting had left Abigail lightheaded and nauseous, her side burning as if the bullet had just struck her. Quinn knelt beside her, his brow furrowed with concern. "Let me check your wound." Too weak to protest, Abigail allowed him to unbutton the lower portion of the flannel shirt. His touch was clinical as he examined the bandage, but she couldn't help the flush that crept up her neck at the intimacy of the moment. "It started bleeding again," he said, his voice neutral. "I need to rewrap it." As he worked, applying a poultice of herbs he'd gathered along the way before binding the wound with fresh bandages, Abigail studied his face. Up close, she could see flecks of gold in his hazel eyes and a thin scar that ran along his jawline, nearly hidden by several days' worth of stubble. "How did you get that scar?" she asked, partly to distract herself from the pain and partly out of genuine curiosity. Quinn's hand stilled momentarily. "Shawnee Raid when I was 14. My family had a small homestead in Kansas Territory." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "I was the only one who survived." Abigail's heart contracted. "I'm so sorry," he shrugged, resuming his work. "It was a long time ago." "Is that why you fought in the war?" "Partly. Mostly I was young and stupid, thought I had something to prove." His voice turned bitter. "Found out soon enough there's no glory in watching friends die in the mud." When he finished with the bandage, Quinn moved away to prepare a simple meal from their provisions. Abigail watched him, thinking how different he was from the men she'd known in Boston, men who wore their accomplishments like badges, who spoke of honor and duty from the safety of drawing rooms. Quinn Garrett carried his experiences in the lines of his face and the careful precision of his movements, in his silences as much as his words. "We should rest here until evening," he said, handing her a strip of jerky and hardtack. "Travel will be cooler and we'll leave less of a trail." Abigail nodded, though the thought of getting back on a horse made her side throb in anticipation. "Quinn," she said hesitantly, "if something happens to me, the journal needs to reach Red Eagle. Promise me you'll deliver it." His expression darkened. "Nothing's going to happen to you." "We both know that's not a promise you can make," she countered softly. "Please, this is bigger than either of us." After a long moment, Quinn nodded. "I promise. But you're going to deliver it yourself, Abigail Sutton. You've got more spine than most men I've known." Something in the way he said her name with a mixture of respect and something warmer made her breath catch. "Thank you," she managed. "Get some rest," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll keep watch." Though she tried to fight it, exhaustion soon pulled Abigail into a fitful sleep. She dreamed again of her father, but this time he was smiling, pointing to a horizon where Quinn Garrett waited on horseback, silhouetted against a setting sun. She woke to Quinn's hand on her shoulder and the soft glow of twilight filtering into the cave. "Time to go," he said quietly. The cool evening air revived her somewhat as they set off once more. Quinn had fashioned a more comfortable way for her to sit, using his bedroll as cushioning, and kept Thunder at an easy pace despite his obvious desire to cover ground quickly. As darkness fell completely, the stars emerged in breathtaking profusion, more stars than Abigail had ever imagined possible, blanketing the sky from horizon to horizon. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tilting her head back to take in the magnificent display. "One of the few things I never tire of out here," Quinn agreed, his voice a low rumble she could feel through his chest. "Makes a man feel small, but not in a bad way. Like being reminded there's something greater than ourselves, something like that." There was a smile in his voice. You sound like a woman who spent time thinking about such things. Abigail smiled into the darkness. My father encouraged curiosity. He believed education shouldn't be wasted on daughters any more than sons. A progressive man. He was. She paused, memories washing over her. After my mother died, he took me with him on his expeditions whenever he could. I learned to identify rock formations before I learned to embroider, much to my aunt's dismay. Quinn chuckled, the sound vibrating through her. I'd wager you can do both exceptionally well. The geology, certainly. My embroidery leaves much to be desired. Their quiet conversation continued as they rode through the night, sharing pieces of their lives in the comfortable anonymity of darkness. Quinn told her of his years as an Army scout, of the vastness of the untamed West, of the changing world as railroads and settlements pushed ever further into wilderness. Abigail spoke of Boston, of her father's work and her own truncated studies, of her dreams to someday continue his research. It was strange how easily they fell into this rhythm of sharing. Two strangers bound by circumstance and a dead man's mission. Yet with each passing hour, Abigail felt less like a burden Quinn had reluctantly assumed and more like a partner in their dangerous undertaking. Near midnight they stopped to rest in a small clearing. While Quinn tended to Thunder, Abigail tried to stretch her aching muscles, wincing as the movement pulled at her wound. "We're making good time," Quinn said, joining her with a canteen of water. "Should reach the foothills by dawn." Abigail took a long drink, then passed the canteen back to him. Their fingers brushed, and even in the darkness she could sense his eyes on her. "You should have told me you were in pain," he said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before. "It's manageable," she replied, unwilling to be the reason for further delay. "I'm stronger than I look." "I don't doubt that." Quinn hesitated, then added, "Still, there's no shame in admitting when you need help, Abigail." The way he said her name sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Before she could respond, Quinn's posture suddenly changed, his body going rigid with alertness. "Get down," he whispered, his hand already reaching for his rifle. Abigail dropped to a crouch, her heart hammering as Quinn moved silently to the edge of the clearing. For several tense moments, there was nothing but the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a night bird. Then she heard it, the soft nicker of a horse that wasn't Thunder. Quinn was back at her side in an instant, pulling her toward their mount. "Riders," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "At least 3 coming fast." Fear shot through her as he lifted her onto Thunder's back and swung up behind her. "Holden," she whispered. "Can't be sure, but we're not waiting to find out." He wrapped one arm securely around her waist. "Hold tight." Thunder surged forward at Quinn's command, plunging into the forest at a pace that seemed reckless in the darkness. Branches whipped past, and Abigail clung to the saddle horn, her wound screaming with each jolting stride. Behind them, shouts erupted, followed by the thunder of pursuing hooves. "They've spotted us," Quinn said grimly, urging Thunder faster still. "When I say drop, you slide off to the right and stay down, understand?" "What? No." Abigail twisted to look at him. "I won't leave you, not leaving me, creating a diversion." His arm tightened around her. "Trust me, Abigail." Before she could protest further, Quinn veered Thunder sharply toward a densely wooded slope. "Now, drop." Instinct overrode fear. Abigail let go of the saddle and felt herself sliding from the horse's back. Quinn's steady hand guided her fall, and she hit the ground rolling as he'd shown her earlier. Pain exploded in her side as she came to rest against a fallen log, but she bit back a cry, watching as Quinn and Thunder continued up the slope at full speed. The pursuing riders charged past her hiding place, their attention fixed on the fleeing horsemen. Abigail held her breath, counting 4 men in the darkness. Silas Holden's distinctive voice carried back to her. "Alive! I want him alive!" Heart pounding, she pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the log. Quinn was leading them away from her deliberately, making himself the target. The realization brought a wave of both gratitude and terror. What would they do to him if they caught him? The sounds of pursuit faded into the distance. Abigail waited, counting slowly to 100 as Quinn had instructed her to do if they were ever separated. Then, clutching her satchel with one hand and her throbbing side with the other, she began to make her way carefully through the underbrush, following the direction Quinn had showed her on the map that morning. East toward the river, then north along its banks. If they were separated, he'd said, head for the river and wait. He would find her. The forest was alive with night sounds, the hoot of owls, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Each snap of a twig made her freeze, listening for human pursuit. But it seemed Holden's men were fully committed to chasing Quinn. After what felt like hours of painstaking progress, the trees began to thin. Abigail could hear the murmur of flowing water ahead. Hope surged through her aching body as she pushed forward, emerging from the forest onto the rocky bank of a fast-flowing river. In the pale light of the setting moon, she could make out the terrain's steep banks dropping to swirling water, a fallen tree creating a natural bridge downstream, mountains rising in the distance. This had to be the river Quinn had indicated. Exhausted and in pain, Abigail made her way to a cluster of boulders that offered some shelter from the wind and possible observation. She wedged herself into a crevice, clutching the precious satchel to her chest, and settled in to wait. Morning found her stiff, cold, and desperately worried. There had been no sign of Quinn through the long night. Had Holden's men caught him? Was he lying injured somewhere in the forest? Or worse, the thought sent a stab of pain through her that had nothing to do with her wound. In just 2 days, Quinn Garrett had become more than a guide or protector. He was a man she respected, whose quiet strength and unexpected kindness had begun to fill the hollow space her father's death had left. As the sun climbed higher, Abigail forced herself to be practical. She found a sheltered pool where she could wash her face and drink, then chewed on a piece of jerky from the small pouch Quinn had insisted she carry. The river provided good visibility in both directions, so she would see anyone approaching. By midday, her worry had hardened into resolve. If Quinn didn't return by nightfall, she would continue north along the river as planned. The mission came first, her father's last wish, the warning that could save the Blackfeet from losing their land. Quinn would expect her to carry on. She was about to move to a new position with better shade when movement on the far bank caught her eye. Abigail froze, heart pounding, as a figure emerged from the trees. Even at a distance, she recognized Quinn's distinctive gait, though he was leading Thunder on foot rather than riding. Relief flooded through her, so intense it made her dizzy. Without thinking, she stood and waved, then immediately regretted drawing attention as Quinn urgently gestured for her to get down. Confused, she ducked back among the boulders, watching as Quinn carefully scanned the area before leading Thunder to the fallen tree downstream. With impressive skill, he guided the horse across the makeshift bridge, then hurried toward her position. Up close, she could see that his face was bruised, a cut above his eye crusted with dried blood. His shirt was torn and dirty, but his eyes lit up when they found her. "You're alive," he breathed, reaching her hiding place and dropping to one knee beside her. "Thank God." "I thought they'd caught you," Abigail said, fighting the urge to throw her arms around him. "What happened?" Quinn glanced over his shoulder, his expression grim. "They nearly did. Thunder and I led them on a chase halfway to Wyoming before I managed to lose them in a box canyon." He touched her arm lightly. "Are you hurt?" "No more than I was," she assured him. "But you're injured." He dismissed this with a shake of his head. "Nothing serious, but we need to move quickly." I doubled back and spotted 2 of Holden's men patrolling the river about 3 miles south. "They know we're heading north." "How could they know that?" Abigail asked, alarmed. Quinn's expression darkened. "Because they found my map in my saddlebag." "I'm sorry, Abigail. They know we're trying to reach Red Eagle." The implications hit her with chilling clarity. "They'll try to get there first, or intercept us along the way. Either way, we're racing against time now." He helped her to her feet. "Can you ride?" Despite the pain and exhaustion, Abigail nodded firmly. "Yes." Quinn studied her face for a moment, then nodded back. "We'll follow the river until nightfall, then cut across country. It's rougher terrain, but less chance of an ambush." As he helped her mount Thunder, Abigail noticed him wince when he raised his left arm. "You're hurt worse than you're letting on," she accused softly. His eyes met hers, a flicker of something vulnerable passing through them before he looked away. "I've had worse," he said simply. "We need to focus on getting that journal to Red Eagle before Holden's men can interfere." They set off at a brisk pace, staying close to the tree line for cover while following the river's winding course. Quinn was more vigilant than ever, constantly scanning their surroundings and stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. As the day wore on, Abigail found herself studying him with new eyes. The man who had initially seemed so taciturn and remote was revealing layers of complexity with each passing hour. His determination to complete her father's mission, despite his own injuries. The gentle way he helped her mount and dismount, mindful of her wound. The rare smiles that transformed his weathered face when she managed to coax them from him. By the time they stopped to rest in the late afternoon, Abigail had come to a startling realization. She was developing feelings for Quinn Garrett that went far beyond gratitude or admiration. The thought should have alarmed her. She'd known him barely 3 days. They were in constant danger. He was nothing like the cultured, educated men her father had always expected her to favor. And yet, there was a depth to Quinn, an integrity and quiet wisdom that called to something fundamental in her soul. "Penny for your thoughts," Quinn said, interrupting her reverie as he handed her a strip of jerky. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was just wondering about Red Eagle. Will he believe us? Trust us with this information?" If Quinn suspected this wasn't her true thought, he didn't show it. "Red Eagle is known for his wisdom. He'll listen before he judges." He settled beside her on a fallen log. "Your father's reputation will help. The Blackfeet respected him for dealing honestly with them." "Did you ever meet my father?" Abigail asked. Realizing she'd never questioned the connection directly, Quinn shook his head. "No, but I knew of him. Word gets around about the rare white men who treat the tribes with respect." He paused, then added, "When his letter reached me, asking me to help you if necessary, I looked into him. George Sutton was a good man by all accounts." "Yes, he was." Abigail blinked back unexpected tears. "It still doesn't seem real that he's gone." Without warning, Quinn reached out and covered her hand with his. The simple gesture of comfort nearly undid her composure entirely. "The work he started won't die with him," Quinn said, his voice low and earnest. "We'll make sure of that." The "we" hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Abigail turned her hand beneath his so their palms met, fingers intertwining naturally. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rushing river. Quinn's eyes, warm hazel in the afternoon light, held hers. For a moment she thought he might say something more, might acknowledge the current that seemed to flow between them. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "We should keep moving," he said, rising to his feet. "Still a lot of ground to cover before dark." As they continued their journey, Abigail found herself replaying that brief touch, the warmth of his calloused palm against hers, the strength and gentleness combined in that simple contact. It was foolish to dwell on such things when their lives were in danger, when the fate of an entire tribe might depend on their successful delivery of her father's journal. And yet, she couldn't help wondering if Quinn felt it too, this inexplicable connection that seemed to defy their short acquaintance and dangerous circumstances. By nightfall, they had left the river behind, cutting across open country toward a range of low hills that Quinn said marked the edge of traditional Blackfeet territory. The night sky was clear and brilliant with stars once again, the air growing cooler as they gained elevation. They made camp in a sheltered draw, where a spring provided fresh water and rocky outcroppings offered protection from the wind. Quinn insisted on checking Abigail's wound again, his expression serious as he examined the healing gash. "The bleeding stopped," he said with evident relief. "But you need real rest, not hours on horseback." "I'm fine," Abigail insisted, though in truth every muscle in her body ached with fatigue. Quinn gave her a look that clearly said he didn't believe her but wouldn't argue. "Try to sleep. I'll keep watch." "You need rest too," she countered. "You've barely slept since we left your cabin." After a moment's hesitation, Quinn nodded. "We'll take turns, 2 hours each." It was a compromise, and Abigail accepted it gratefully, settling onto the bedroll he laid out for her. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come immediately. She watched as Quinn moved around their small camp, his movements economical and quiet. When he finally sat with his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees, his profile was outlined against the starry sky like a figure from an old tale, the lone sentinel, guardian against the darkness. "Quinn," she said softly. He turned, eyebrows raised in question. "Why did you really agree to help me? The truth." For a long moment he was silent, and Abigail thought he might not answer. Then he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. "Your father's letter mentioned that you had his passion for justice, his courage." Quinn's voice was low, almost hesitant. "Said you were willing to risk everything to finish what he started." He looked away, across the darkened landscape. "I've spent 5 years hiding from the world, Abigail. Telling myself I was at peace when really I was just empty. Your father's letter reminded me there are still things worth fighting for." The raw honesty of his words touched something deep within her. "And now," she asked, barely above a whisper, "do you still feel empty?" Quinn turned back to her, his expression unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "No," he said simply, "not anymore." The weight of what remained unspoken hung in the air between them, almost tangible in the quiet night. Abigail's heart beat faster, but before she could respond, Quinn cleared his throat and looked away. "You should sleep," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruff tone. "Morning comes early out here." Though disappointment flickered through her, Abigail nodded and settled back onto the bedroll. As she drifted toward sleep, she thought she felt the light touch of fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face, but it might have been the wind, or a dream already taking hold. She woke to Quinn's hand on her shoulder and the first pale light of dawn streaking the eastern sky. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she leaned into his touch. Their faces were unexpectedly close, and something flickered in Quinn's eyes before he pulled back, clearing his throat. "We need to move," he said, standing quickly. "I heard riders in the distance about an hour ago." Fully awake now, Abigail scrambled to her feet. "Holden's men, can't be sure, but we shouldn't take chances." Quinn was already rolling up their bedding, his movements swift and efficient. If we push hard, we can reach Red Eagle's camp by nightfall." They ate a hasty breakfast of hardtack and dried apple as Quinn saddled Thunder. The horse seemed to sense their urgency, standing patiently despite his obvious eagerness to move. As they set off across the rolling hills, Abigail noted that Quinn's posture was more rigid than usual, his gaze constantly scanning the horizon. The easy companionship of the previous evening seemed to have been replaced by a tense vigilance that left little room for conversation. The sun climbed higher, beating down with increasing intensity as morning gave way to afternoon. They stopped briefly to rest Thunder and drink from their canteens, but Quinn was clearly anxious to keep moving. "There's something you're not telling me," Abigail said as they prepared to mount again. "What did you really hear this morning?" Quinn hesitated, then sighed. "It wasn't just riders. I heard shots fired, signal shots like they were coordinating positions." He met her eyes directly. "They're not just following us anymore, Abigail. They're setting up to intercept us before we reach the Blackfeet." Fear coiled in her stomach, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Then we need a different route." "There isn't one, not if we want to reach Red Eagle today." Quinn's expression was grim. "The pass ahead is the only way through these hills unless we backtrack 20 miles. So we fight our way through," Abigail said with more confidence than she felt. A hint of a smile touched Quinn's lips. "Not exactly what I had in mind." He pointed to a ridge line to their east. "We go up and over instead of through the pass. It's rough country, too steep for horses in most places. They won't expect us to try it. But Thunder will have to be left behind for now." Quinn patted the horse's neck apologetically. "He knows these hills. If he doesn't find us by tomorrow, he'll make his way back to the cabin." The thought of continuing on foot through such terrain, especially with her injury, was daunting. But Abigail trusted Quinn's judgment. If he said this was their best chance, she believed him. They left Thunder concealed in a small grove of aspens with access to water, then began the arduous climb up the steep hillside. Quinn insisted on carrying both their packs, despite Abigail's protests, and set a pace that was challenging but not impossible for her to maintain. The ascent was grueling. Loose shale made footing treacherous, and thick stands of scrub oak scratched at their clothes and skin. By the time they reached the ridge line, Abigail's wound was throbbing anew and sweat soaked through the bandages. Quinn helped her to a sheltered spot between two boulders, his expression concerned as he noted her paleness. "Rest," he said, offering his canteen. "We've made good time." From their elevated position, they could see for miles in every direction. The pass Quinn had mentioned was clearly visible below them, a natural corridor through the otherwise impassable hills. And just as he'd predicted, they could make out the small figures of mounted men stationed at strategic points along its length. 6, maybe 7 of them, Quinn murmured, surveying the scene through a small spyglass. "They're well positioned." Abigail took the spyglass when he offered it, studying the men below. "Is that Holden?" she asked, indicating a figure on a distinctive black horse who seemed to be giving orders. Quinn's jaw tightened as he looked. "Yes, he's coordinating personally now. He must be truly desperate to stop us. Or truly greedy." Quinn's voice was hard. "Gold makes men lose their reason." They rested for half an hour, then continued along the ridge, moving as quickly as possible while staying below the skyline to avoid being spotted from below. The terrain was less steep, but still challenging, with loose rocks that threatened to start small avalanches with every misplaced step. By late afternoon, they had made it across the most exposed section of the ridge and begun their descent toward the valley beyond. According to Quinn, Red Eagle's summer camp lay just a few miles ahead, near a lake fed by mountain streams. "We're going to make it," Abigail said, allowing herself to feel hopeful for the first time that day. Quinn nodded, but his expression remained vigilant. "We're not there yet." They had just started down a particularly steep section when the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Quinn reacted instantly, pulling Abigail down behind a boulder as a bullet whined off the rocks inches from where they'd been standing. "Damn it," he muttered, cautiously peering around the edge of their shelter. "Scout on the far ridge must have spotted our movement." More shots followed, kicking up dust and rock fragments around their position. Abigail pressed herself against the boulder, heart racing, as Quinn drew his rifle and returned fire with careful precision. "We're pinned down," he said grimly after exchanging several shots with their unseen attacker. "And those shots will bring the rest of Holden's men." "What do we do?" Abigail asked, clutching the satchel containing her father's journal. Quinn's eyes met hers, determination evident in their depths. "I'll draw their fire. You keep going down this ravine. It leads straight to the valley floor. Red Eagle's camp is northeast from there, maybe 2 miles. Look for the smoke from their fires." "No," Abigail grabbed his arm. "I won't leave you behind." "This isn't a debate, Abigail." His voice was firm but gentle. "That journal is what matters. You need to get it to Red Eagle." "You matter too," she insisted, her voice breaking slightly. "We'll find another way." Quinn's expression softened. He reached out, his calloused hand cupping her cheek with surprising tenderness. "I promised your father I'd make sure his message was delivered. This is the only way to ensure that happens." Before she could protest further, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a brief, fierce kiss. The contact was over almost before Abigail could register it had happened, leaving her breathless and stunned. "Go," Quinn said softly, pulling away. "I'll find you when I can." Then he was moving, darting from their shelter to a position several yards away and firing rapidly to draw attention from their previous location. More bullets pinged off the rocks around him, but he seemed unconcerned with his own safety as he continued to provide covering fire. Tears blurring her vision, Abigail forced herself to move, slipping down the steep ravine as Quinn had directed. The sound of gunfire receded as she descended, replaced by the pounding of her own heart and the rasp of her labored breathing. By the time she reached the valley floor, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. Abigail paused, trying to orient herself. "Northeast," Quinn had said. "Look for smoke." There a thin column of smoke rising against the darkening sky, perhaps 2 miles distant as he'd estimated. Gathering her remaining strength, Abigail set off toward it, every step carrying her away from Quinn and the ongoing gunfight on the ridge. The valley was open grassland, offering little cover. Abigail moved as quickly as her injured body would allow, constantly glancing back toward the ridge where occasional gunshots still echoed. As darkness fell completely, she had to navigate by the stars and the distant glow of campfires that grew steadily larger as she approached. She had covered perhaps half the distance when she heard the thunder of hooves behind her. Terror surged through her veins as she turned to see a rider approaching at speed, silhouetted against the starlit sky. There was nowhere to hide in the open grassland. Abigail clutched the satchel to her chest and forced her exhausted legs to run, knowing it was futile but unwilling to surrender without a fight. The rider closed the distance quickly. Just as Abigail prepared to turn and face her pursuer, a familiar voice called out, "Abigail, it's me." She stumbled to a halt, disbelieving as Quinn rained thunder to a stop beside her. His face was streaked with dirt and what looked like blood, but he was grinning with fierce triumph. "How?" she gasped, barely able to speak through her relief and exhaustion. Quinn dismounted in one fluid motion, his arms going around her to support her swaying form. "Turns out there was only one scout," he explained. "Once I took care of him, I doubled back to where we left Thunder, figured I might catch up to you before you reached the camp." "You're hurt," Abigail said, noticing a fresh tear in his sleeve and the dark stain spreading beneath it. "Just a graze." He dismissed it with a shake of his head. "But Holden and his men won't be far behind. We need to move." He helped her onto Thunder's back, then mounted behind her, his arms encircling her with familiar security as they set off toward the distant campfires at a gallop. They were close enough now to make out individual teepees and the movement of people around the central fires when shouts erupted behind them. Glancing back, Abigail saw several riders cresting a low rise, their pursuit illuminated by the rising moon. "Almost there," Quinn encouraged, urging Thunder to a final burst of speed. As they approached the camp, figures emerged from the shadows, Blackfeet warriors with rifles raised, alerted by the commotion of their arrival. Quinn called out in a language Abigail didn't understand, his words causing the warriors to lower their weapons slightly, though they remained wary. One man stepped forward, older than the others, his face lined with age and wisdom. He responded to Quinn in the same language, his eyes moving between them and the approaching riders with keen assessment. "Red Eagle," Quinn explained quickly to Abigail, helping her dismount. "I told him we come with important news and that those men mean harm." Abigail stepped forward, clutching the satchel. "My father was George Sutton," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "He sent me to deliver this to you before he died." Recognition flickered in Red Eagle's dark eyes at her father's name. He gestured for her to follow him, barking orders that sent his warriors moving into defensive positions as Holden and his men drew closer. Inside Red Eagle's teepee, Abigail handed over her father's journal with trembling hands. Quinn stayed close beside her, translating as needed while the Blackfeet leader examined the detailed maps and notes. Outside, voices raised in anger. Holden was demanding their surrender, threatening consequences if the Blackfeet interfered with railroad business. Red Eagle looked up from the journal, his expression grave but determined. He spoke at length, Quinn translating his words for Abigail. "He says your father was a true friend to the Blackfeet. This information confirms what they have suspected, that the railroad seeks to steal more than just the land for tracks." Quinn paused, listening as Red Eagle continued. "He will send riders tonight to the other bands, and to Fort Benton, where there is a government agent who has been fair in the past. They will fight this deception with both traditional and white man's law." Relief washed over Abigail so intensely that her knees nearly buckled. Quinn's arm slipped around her waist, supporting her discreetly. "What about Holden?" she asked. Red Eagle's smile was grim as he responded. Quinn chuckled softly as he translated. "He says Holden and his men are now surrounded by 30 Blackfeet warriors. They can either leave peacefully or not leave at all." The standoff outside was tense but brief. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Holden had no choice but to retreat, though his parting threats made it clear this was not the end of the matter. Red Eagle insisted that Abigail and Quinn remain as honored guests while she recovered from her wound. A medicine woman treated both their injuries with poultices and herbs that proved remarkably effective. Within days, Abigail was moving freely again, the angry red gash on her side healing cleanly. During their stay, she watched Quinn with growing admiration. He moved among the Blackfeet with ease, speaking their language fluently and treating everyone from the youngest child to the oldest elder with equal respect. It was clear they regarded him highly in return, not as one of them, but as a trusted friend. On their third evening in the camp, Abigail found Quinn sitting alone by the lake, watching the sunset paint the water with gold and crimson. She settled beside him on the grassy bank, comfortable now in the buckskin dress the women had given her to replace her ruined clothes. "Red Eagle says the government agent arrived today," she said. "He's apparently furious about the railroad's deception and has promised to take the matter to Washington." Quinn nodded, his eyes still on the sunset. "It's a start. The fight isn't over, but at least now they have a chance." "Because of my father," Abigail said softly, "and because of you." He turned to her then, his expression serious. "Because of you, Abigail. You're the one who carried his message through hell and high water. I just rode along." She smiled at his deliberate understatement. "Is that what you call it, just riding along?" Her voice grew softer. "You saved my life more than once. You risked everything for a mission that wasn't yours." "Seemed worth the risk," Quinn said simply, his eyes holding hers. Abigail's heart quickened at what she saw in those eyes, a warmth and admiration that mirrored her own feelings. "Quinn," she began hesitantly, "when this is all over, what will you do?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering. "I'm not sure my cabin feels like home anymore," he finally said. 5 years of hiding from the world was probably enough. And if there was a reason to start over somewhere else? Abigail hardly dared breathe as she waited for his response. Quinn reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. "What kind of reason did you have in mind?" Gathering her courage, Abigail leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that held all the words she couldn't yet say. Unlike their first brief, desperate kiss on the ridge, this one lingered, deepening as Quinn's hand came up to cradle the back of her head. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Quinn rested his forehead against hers. "I think that might be reason enough," he murmured. Abigail smiled, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He always told me to find a man who would hear me, even when the rest of the world wouldn't listen." Quinn brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch infinitely gentle. "Your voice is the only one I want to hear for the rest of my days." Abigail Sutton. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony that combined Blackfeet traditions with a Christian blessing from a passing missionary. Red Eagle himself gave Abigail away, honoring the daughter of his friend with the highest respect of his tribe. Word came from Fort Benton that Silas Holden had been arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. His scheme exposed thanks to George Sutton's detailed documentation. The railroad would still come through, but now under the watchful eyes of both the government and the Blackfeet, with fair compensation and respected boundaries. As summer turned to autumn, Abigail and Quinn built a new life together. Not at his remote cabin, but in a small trading post at the edge of Blackfeet territory, where they could serve as intermediaries between two worlds. Quinn's knowledge of native languages and customs, combined with Abigail's education and determination, made them valuable allies to both the tribe and the settlers who continued to arrive in the territory. In the evenings, they would often sit together on the porch of their modest home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. Sometimes Abigail would speak of her father, of Boston, of the life she'd left behind. Sometimes Quinn would tell stories of his years as a scout, of the vast wilderness he'd crossed, of the solitude he'd once thought was peace. But mostly they spoke of the future of the children they hoped to have, of the community they were helping to build, of their dreams for a world where different peoples might live together with understanding and respect. And always, when Abigail's voice grew tired or faltered with emotion, Quinn would lean close and whisper, "I hear you louder than the world." 5 years later, As spring brought new life to the Montana territory, Abigail stood in the doorway of their home, watching Quinn teach their 4-year-old son George how to gentle a young horse in the corral. Their 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth played at her feet, arranging pebbles in patterns that only she understood. The trading post had grown into a small settlement, with a school where Abigail taught 3 days a week and a clinic staffed by a young doctor from Philadelphia who had arrived the previous fall. The Blackfeet still maintained their traditional lands, protected now by treaties that were actually enforced, thanks in part to the continued advocacy of Quinn and Abigail. Red Eagle visited often, now officially recognized as an elder statesman by the territorial government. He delighted in teaching young George the Blackfeet language and telling him stories of his grandfather's bravery. As Abigail watched her family, contentment washed over her like a gentle wave. The path that had brought her here had been dangerous and uncertain, marked by loss and fear. But it had also led her to a love she would never have found in Boston's drawing rooms, to a purpose greater than she could have imagined, to a life rich with meaning and connection. Quinn looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still rare but always genuine, warmed her heart as it had from the beginning. He said something to George, then crossed to where she stood, sweeping Elizabeth up into his arms as he reached them. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" he asked, leaning down to kiss her softly. Abigail smiled up at him, this man who had heard her when her voice was weakest, who had taught her strength she didn't know she possessed, who had shown her that love could be built on both passion and partnership. "I was thinking that sometimes the most unexpected journeys lead us exactly where we're meant to be," she said, her voice clear and strong in the Montana sunshine. Quinn's arm slipped around her waist, pulling her and their children into an embrace that felt like home. "I couldn't agree more, Mrs. Garrett," he murmured against her hair. "I couldn't agree more." In the distance, the train whistle sounded a reminder of how the world was changing, of how far they had come from that desperate day when a wounded Boston woman and a solitary cowboy had found each other in the wilderness. But here, in this moment, surrounded by the family and community they had built together, Abigail knew that some things would never change. The love that had begun with a whispered promise beside a rushing creek had only grown stronger with each passing season. And though life on the frontier remained challenging, though their work was never truly done, Abigail Sutton Garrett faced each dawn with the certainty that her voice, once weak with fear and pain, would always be heard by the man who loved her louder than the world.